So much of the country in the United States has been enduring a heat wave this past week. We certainly were here where I was in Pennsylvania, where we had temperatures upwards of 100 degrees, which is pretty unusual, at least in terms of my experience, which is having lived here for only a year. So take that for what it's worth. But we saw inevitably a lot of stories blaming climate change. And so there's a New York Times headline that said heat waves in the age of climate change, longer, more frequent, and more dangerous. And in the article, it cites the US Global Change Research Program reporting that, quote, since the 1960s, the average number of heat waves, defined as 2 or more consecutive days where the daily lows exceeded historical July and August temperatures in 50 major American cities, has tripled. And you might have noticed that the data it cited was historic lows. And Ronald Bailey from Reason Magazine pointed out that, yeah, that is accurate, but it's also odd that they're looking at the daily low temperatures rather than the daily high temperatures. And so he went and looked at the 2017 Fourth National Climate Assessment Report that showed that heat waves measured as daily high or high daily temperatures are becoming less common in the contiguous U.S., not more frequent. And I think that's interesting and it's worth knowing. And it's surprising that the Times didn't at least mention that, because certainly it's not exactly buried in some unknown researcher's footnote. But even setting that aside, I mean, look, there was a heat wave. And I mentioned, here we got up to 100 degrees. Now, thankfully, in my household, we were saved by human ingenuity in the form of our air conditioning units. Unfortunately, we overloaded a circuit a few times, and so when we were not paying attention, our upstairs power wasn't on, and by the time we realized it and were ready to go to bed, it was sweltering. And now, thankfully, this is a really easily fixable problem, right? We just went and switched the circuit breaker on and off, and eventually moved some plugs around. But I mean, imagine a full-scale blackout in conditions where it's 100 degrees or more. It becomes certainly a real painful situation, but I mean, it can also be a very dangerous situation. And one of the really terrifying things to me is that because of anti-fossil fuel policies, it is becoming more likely that more people will face full-scale blackouts in precisely these kinds of extreme weather conditions. So, I mean, the first thing that's happening, as we've talked about in this show, is that the world is increasing our reliance on unreliable wind and solar. And, as we've talked about, that increases risks of blackouts. We discussed the example in South Australia where this actually happened because of the, extreme amount of wind that they, capacity that they have, and the fact that there was less wind than predicted. And then we're also at the same time decreasing the reliability of our fuel, shutting down coal, shutting down nuclear, blocking natural gas pipelines. We've talked about in this show the way that, New York has basically made it impossible to build pipelines running to New England, and that New England has been waving its hands and saying, we don't have the natural gas that we need to deal of times of extreme demand. And so I am not afraid of more heat waves. I'm afraid that our energy policy will make us more vulnerable to every heat wave. Any thoughts, Stefan?
Yeah, so I think the rationale for looking at the minimum temperatures that you mentioned in one of the articles, I think it was a New York Times article, was something like, oh, if the heat doesn't cool down during nighttime, then this is particularly dangerous to vulnerable people like older people or sick people and so on, which has some plausibility in argument. But I've seen a lot of analysis of this situation, and it seems like the heat waves of the 1930s, of the Dust Bowl era, were actually significantly worse. This is sort of what the data suggests overall. And also, when you look at these statistics, these are sufficiently complex that you can look at it from all kinds of different angles. So you could say, well, compared to the 1930s, what is the length of a heat wave? What is the minimum temperature? What's the maximum? What's the average? How many days a year, and so on. So there are so many like variables in this that you can cherry pick. And if you don't give the full picture of this, of course, you can make all kinds of arguments. And we haven't even talked about something like the urban heat island effect, where maybe even the observational data of temperatures is somewhat off if we do not consider something like, oh, the populated areas have actually increased in size and created a sort of a temperature bias into the thermometer record and so on. So this would have to be discussed in great detail and with some depths of knowledge of the actual statistic, how they come together, and what do they say. And but overall, it's not implausible that heat waves are getting somewhat stronger. The data in the National Climate Assessment didn't suggest like a crazy rapid growth rate. It just said, okay, in the 1930s it was probably worse, and then it went down a little bit, and then starting in the 1970s it went up a slight tick, but not as much as in the 1930s. So this is perfectly consistent with a mild warming trend in climate. Of course, you will get extreme weather, and even if the climate was perfectly stable, you would every now and then, just from the probability perspective, you would shatter some heat and some cold records all the time, even if the climate was perfectly stable, which is impossible, of course. But you don't get that picture if you don't carefully analyze it and give the full context of this. And these news articles never give that.